Eudora Welty is one of the premier short story writers of the 20th century. Born in and lived most of her life in Jackson, Mississippi, born in 1909, died in 2001. So she saw a remarkable span of culture, let's say, in that time when you consider she lived through and remembered the Depression in the Deep South, in the Jim Crow South, and saw the civil rights movement and everything that shaped from that. As a short story writer, as a novelist, and also as a photographer, she chronicled that culture's transition through that time in pretty remarkable terms. The premier example of her work is the short story A Worn Path, which she wrote in 1941. And it comes out bearing all the marks of, well, Jim Crow, the Depression, and the peculiar culture that was the old Confederacy at the time, giving it a different flavor than her chief rival in this regard, in her style, I would say, would have to be Faulkner. And the peculiarity of her voice sets him apart from her. She is her own artist. And of course, she lived much longer than he did. She wasn't quite the raging alcoholic, so maybe that had something to do with it. She was also a little younger, so, but she lived a good, long life. And through that, she was able to offer an awful lot. And A Worn Path shows her at her heights. And it is a fairly simple story on its surface. An elderly black woman in rural Mississippi walks a long way to get medicine for her sick grandchild. Along the way, she overcomes obstacles of nature and society, driven on by a almost unconscious instinct for survival and love. And it's it's not a long short story, but it's remarkably pregnant with meaning in its style, in its in the images that it evokes, in the portrait it portrays of a very specific time and a very specific place. It gives a very full understanding of what life was like there, with greater significance for all of us. Most significantly, I would say, in this story is its style. There is an unreliable narrator of sorts. It is a third person. Narrative, but with a close association at times with the woman itself. It is almost as if this entire story is effectively an extreme close-up on her as she engages with certain other people along the way, but it's very tight on her, and we can, in an almost postmodernist way, drift into her thoughts from time to time. And it's in those moments that the style gets a little bit more unorthodox, or a little bit more, let's say, abstract. Those moments are deliberate. They portray the somewhat wandering thoughts of this, at this point, fairly old woman. And you can see this in a lot of Welty's work, that only by patient attention to the details of a story of a life can it start to take on meaning. All those little details start to coalesce into a coherent portrait. And in this case, of a very steadfast and remarkably strong woman pursuing a very clear goal. The beginning is very realistic, very modernist in its way. It sticks very closely to an almost Hemingway-esque style of single-syllable diction and ordinary verbs that toggles into occasional wafts of poetry. It was December. A bright frozen day in the early morning. Far out in the country, there was an old Negro woman with her head tied in a red rag, coming along a path in the pine woods. Her name was Phoenix Jackson. She was very old and small and walked slowly in the dark pine shadows, moving a little from side to side in steps. with the balanced heaviness and lightness of a pendulum in a grandfather clock. She carried a thin, small cane made from an umbrella, and with this she kept tapping the frozen earth in front of her. This made a grave and persistent noise in the still air that seemed meditative, like a chirping of a solitary little bird. It's beautiful. But once we get a little further along, we begin to merge into her thoughts, and the prose becomes much more heavily reminiscent of Faulkner. It goes from borderline Hemingway to much more full-scale Faulkner. Not in the length of the sentences, but in that fractured chunking of detail that gets presented in a very opaque manner, almost as a semi-stream of consciousness at times. Readers experience her efforts very much through her eyes, despite the third-person narration. The third-person narration, however, keeps a barrier between us and her, which keeps the motive, keeps the goal, keeps the purpose of her worn path mission a secret until the big reveal at the end. But that also forces us to spend some time to observe this woman moving along and witness this. And it is an almost sociological study of desperation of living on the extreme poverty in that time and place. The slow accumulation of detail, once again, adds up to meaning at the end. And this underscores that essential message that you need to spend time with people. You cannot rush the knowing of a person, the knowing of a situation, especially something as convoluted as the human heart or a culture as, quite frankly, knotty, knotty, as the post-Civil War South. That engagement pays off ultimately with a kind of understanding, but also one that poses some more probing questions that cannot be resolved, and that ultimately opens this up beyond the very specific time and place. The themes of this story are also very rich. Obviously, one of the first ones that crops to mind is race and class, if you want to conflate those two. The woman's status as the Southern black underclass here, if you will, is the core thread tying the story together. Her interactions with the hunter, the woman with the shopping bags, and the women in the clinic all show the wily deference this woman has to display from time to time as she negotiates her daily life, especially when she wanders along this path out of her familiar home and goes into the so-called white areas. And that negotiation is very fraught in the Jim Crow South, obviously. That subservience, however, is very obviously a mask. Well, it's a complicated mask, but it is a mask that she puts on and takes off selectively, deliberately, strategically, and cautiously. The threat that each of those people, that each of those challenges poses is very, very real. Obviously, anybody with a passing familiarity of the conditions of rural Mississippi in the 1930s and 40s would know this. This becomes especially acute, I would say, when the hunter points his gun at her, even if he seems to be joking or presenting it as a joke. It is a very harsh moment when he seems to be desperately threatening her to go back to, he wants her to go back to her house. Why are you going all the way to the city? The city is Natchez. And why, you should, this is too long of a walk. You should go home. That's a threat to stay within her confines. I think it's fairly obvious. The cost of her dignity in those instances, the cost of her human dignity, her rights as a human being, her civil rights before that movement really caught fire in the South, is a real inflection point into understanding this story. Another prominent theme, I would say, obviously, is endurance and perseverance, persistence. The physical obstacles she has to overcome are pretty daunting. It is a very long trip. The hunter expresses great surprise at the length of her walk. We follow her up and down hills, over streams, through thorn bushes, and even into a ditch. She has negotiated challenges posed by dogs and hostile human beings. She faces down the disorientation of the city itself when she gets there and it's all lit up by Christmas lights. And she is just confused because she is an old woman at this point. And the imposing bureaucracy of the clinic, she is a bit overwhelmed. She has to fight her way through all of these challenges, and she does for her very specific goal, which we don't learn about until the end. The title itself, A Worn Path, suggests that she has done this many times before. The ladies in the clinic say, oh, she is back again. This is something that she perseveres in. She does again and again and again. Her name, Phoenix Jackson. Phoenix implies birth and continuation. In this case, the phoenix might rise each time she takes the walk, or we as readers are witnessing the ashes of Southern civilization from which the spirit of this character will rise as a representative value, which has some very troubling warnings. Let's say, is this story a tribute to her resilience, or is it a threat of retribution brewing on the horizon? Charity, I would say, is another prominent theme here. We have repeated experiences of exchange, economic exchange, if you will. Each portrays an opportunity for charity. Often that opportunity falls short of the charitable spirit, if you will. This becomes more clear when Phoenix arrives in town and we discover the Christmas setting. Christmas, the spirit of giving, the holiday spirit, charity, benevolence, whatever. The hunter tells Phoenix that he has no money, and we know this is a lie because she has already seen a nickel fall out of his pocket and she has stolen it. The nurse at the clinic offers a few pennies to Phoenix at the end, but specifically references Christmas as the purpose of it, suggesting that she feels obligated because of the time of year, something she perhaps might not be inspired to do at another point in the calendar. The holiday spirit is putting a premium on reaching out, on doing unto others, and yet there is a complicated relationship going on. And this is particularly, I would say, interesting when we get to the matter of the women, or the woman with the packages. Now, Phoenix Jackson comes to the city of Natchez, is overwhelmed by all the lights and disoriented and all of that. But when she realizes that her shoes are untied, She stops a woman in the street and asks for help in tying them. Perhaps she doesn't know how. It's a little unclear. She seems physically agile enough to be able to bend down to her shoes. We are told when she is searching for the nickel that she bends very, very low indeed to find it, suggesting simultaneously that perhaps she does not see very well, but she has the physical agility to stoop and even walk around while stooped over. So there's some concern there. But she asks this woman who is carrying packages, which suggests that she might be perhaps wealthier than Phoenix Jackson. During the Depression era in that part of the world, you got to wonder how wealthy. I wouldn't call this person rich. There's not enough evidence for that, but certainly with more disposable income to go and buy Christmas presents and have them wrapped and look pretty. All of this suggests, of course, something that is not necessarily referenced in the episode itself, that this woman is white. So there is a weird dynamic there, and she goes and she asks for help in tying her shoes, and this woman complies. This is a kind of weird inversion of social status, and that makes it very peculiar, very odd, curious. Here, you could say, is the true charitable impulse. This woman immediately acquiesces and says, sure, I will do this. I will tie your shoes. On the sidewalk, on the side of the street, in the middle of town, in front of all of her neighbors, in the Jim Crow South, this woman is going to bend down, put all of her pretty packages on the sidewalk, perhaps, so that she can tie this old woman's shoes, this black woman's shoes, this poor woman's shoes. It's remarkable. It seems just bizarre. You could say that this is the core of the charitable instinct. It demonstrates Phoenix's, certainly, skill in recognizing the charitable instinct, suggesting perhaps that Phoenix is a remarkable individual in her own right for being able to see that spirit in someone else. Yeah, okay, we can obviously say that. She chose wisely in this instance. But in an act of service towards fellow humanity, these two women demonstrate an unselfish instinct for the golden rule, which is admirable. It shows in the heart of the story, right in the very middle of it, that there is evidence of goodness in humanity, that individuals can rise above that, and that is inspiring. But the peculiarity of the incident, it's not explained, and it forces readers to consider what other alternatives there could be for interpreting this incident. It could be something very different than what it appears on the surface. The oddness of the action coming right after the delusion of the Christmas lights calls attention to itself. It makes you wonder, well, it is odd for these two women to do these two things. It is odd, I would say, for Phoenix to ask in the first place. The request is an imposition to just who goes up to a stranger on the sidewalk and says, excuse me, would you tie my shoe? That is a very conspicuous act that I'm not sure is fully in character with Miss Jackson, who shows herself very cautious in general. And here she's going up to a total stranger. And that's risky in a world where she would certainly know not to take risks. And the characteristic of the woman, we don't know anything about the woman other than she seems a little bit wealthier and is probably white. And, well, how likely is that she would just automatically do that? Look at this little exchange itself. It's so short. She moved quietly on the sidewalk where people were passing by. A lady came along in the crowd carrying an armful of red, green, and silver wrapped presents. She gave off perfume like the red roses in hot summer, and Phoenix stopped her. "Please, missy, will you lace up my shoe?" She held up her foot. "What do you want, Grandma?" "See my shoe?" said Phoenix. "Do all right for out in the country, but wouldn't look right to go in a big building." "Stand still then, Grandma," said the lady. She put her packages down on the sidewalk beside her and laced and tied both shoes tightly. The request by Phoenix is pretty haughty, and the idea of a white woman in the Jim Crow South lowering herself to touch a black woman's feet strains belief. While it lends a fullness of character, a fullness of humanity to them, beyond the stereotype, that this is just going a little far. This is pushing it. The act strains credibility, credence, credulity, and it calls attention to itself. It's bizarre. It's asking readers to probe, to think about it, to question, could this really happen? And once considered, it suggests to the reader, well, remember what happened a little earlier with the boy. She had a delusion. She imagined a young boy coming up to her and offering her a piece of cake, and then in a second he was gone. He was just a figment of her imagination. So that laid the predicate that she is not necessarily always in her right mind. She tends to see things that aren't there. Maybe this is that too. Remember, she is disoriented from all the Christmas lights. The woman with the package could be a figment of her imagination, which in this case, the habits of charity might be too much to expect for the reality of that time and place. Now, the foot washing or the shoe tying suggests foot washing, perhaps. Some critics have pointed out the parallel with Christ washing the feet. Actually, foot washing is well beyond Christianity, but Christianity itself is a very large element of this story. This story is loaded with Christian symbolism. Her long worn path is conceivably an analog of the Christian mission on earth, as is Christ's final long walk to his crucifixion, bearing the cross on his back. Phoenix has to deal with thorns. She explicitly evokes God as a witness for all of her actions. The journey itself is a matter of faith often. She does not always know intellectually where she's going, but she trusts that her feet will carry her there. The whole journey is a figuration of the Stations of the Cross, and of course the revolutionary image of Jesus as a poor black woman in Depression era Mississippi is itself fairly striking. But the ultimate question is not whether this woman can be seen as an image of Christ or of Christianity, but whether readers can bridge that gap. The divides of race and class and gender and age and social status of any kind. Can we, as readers, measure up? Can we walk in her shoes, so to speak? Can we call ourselves Christian if we allow all of those divides? If you reject all the categories of age and race and class and all of that stuff, ultimately it comes down to even beyond Christianity, but just decency, human decency. Can we measure up to that? Do we have the fortitude? Do we have the determination, the endurance to overcome. Phoenix Jackson is symbolic of her people. So the reader is called on to be symbolic of people in general. Do we as a society have the charity to overcome our own prejudices, to overcome our own narrowness of thought? Are we all just moving along, forward, stumbling, subject to temptation, subject to weakness, to hostility, with no clear destination that we understand, but driven by some deep-seated desire, which may or may not be apparent to anyone or even ourselves at times? The story prompts a question, but whether or not it offers an answer is a matter of considerable debate, and that is where Eudora Welty shines. That's where A Worn Path rises above the average little story of Depression-era Jim Crow culture. It rises out of the particularity of, gee, isn't that a quaint little small town? And achieves a kind of universality that only great art can claim.